In 2007, the UFC's annual revenue finally went up to $226 million, and Spike TV's Fight Night periodically outperformed Major League Baseball and NBA games that aired at that same time. 2.9% of the total number of people watching television in United States were tuned into the UFC in 2007. Mark Ratner was still working on getting the UFC legally sanctioned in all 50 states. Ratner says, and I quote, "We had a big map of the United States in my office, and the goal was to get it all green. We had it in red. Every time we would get a state approved, we'd have another map made saying Nebraska is now in," unquote. Zuffa signed more than 80 new fighters in 2008, pushing its total roster count to more than 300 fighters. UFC would typically have between 9 and 12 fights per event. Dana White wouldn't negotiate about fighter contracts. He's basically an whatever I say goes type of guy, and it's my way or the highway type of guy. Dana White says, and I quote, "I can tell you this, if you fucking call Joe Silva and turn down a fight, you might as well say fucking rip up my contract," unquote. Dana White hired Joe Silva to do the contract and fight negotiations for the UFC. Joe Silva understood Dana White's point of view of how strict the company was about negotiations, which were for them to not negotiate at all, with Silva often fighting over even just $1,000 payment increases for veterans in the company who had already been there for 10 years. Chris Levin says, and I quote, "When the deal seems to be close to falling apart, Dana steps in with some smooth talk," unquote. When Chris Levin wanted a fight with Rich Franklin and had gotten a fight with Anderson Silva instead and protested that decision, Joe Silva says, and I quote, "Chris, you are taking this fight plain and simple," unquote. After Chris accepted the fight, Dana White says, and I quote, "Chris, that's why you're my guy," unquote. Crazy part is Anderson Silva would go on to knock Chris Levin out in less than a minute, and according to the book, Chris Levin would never come back from that and never again come close to fighting for a UFC championship. Now this is funny. In December 2006, there was a new exciting young fighter named Brandon Vera. He was the new talk of the town, winning his first 4 fights in the UFC and even beating a UFC legend, Frank Mir. Dana sent Brandon a deal, a 3-fight deal, $90,000 a fight, $90,000 a win for the first fight, then $100,000 a fight, $100,000 a win for the second, then $115,000 a fight and win for the third, or a 4-year, $7 million deal with a $100,000 sign-on bonus. So that's $100,000 up front and $7 million paid throughout the 4 years. Brandon Vera emailed Dana that he would be sending his attorney to Vegas to negotiate the terms of the deal. Brandon and his attorney counteroffered and wanted $150,000 to fight and win for the first fight, $175,000 to fight and win for the second fight, and $200,000 to fight and win for the third. Dana White sent Brandon Vera's attorney back to him with the deal of $50,000 to fight and win for the first, $60,000 to fight and win for the second, and $70,000 to fight and win for the third, and a $100,000 sign-on bonus. Brandon Vera fired his attorney and tried to work a deal out with Dana White himself and ended up signing a deal starting at $100,000 to fight and win. Brandon's attorney ended up suing him later on, and the California State Athletic Commission arbitrator eventually ruled in the attorney's favor, requiring Brandon Vera to pay the attorney a percentage of his future earnings. So Brandon got super fucked. The author speaks of the UFC paying fighters undocumented money on the side as a gift or bonus so that the money wouldn't have to be reported to the athletic commissioners, because then they're going to be taking out taxes. Now, this part may be a little far-fetched, could possibly be true, but also could possibly be false because the author doesn't reference who he has gotten this information from, but we shall continue. The author says the side money was directed for more violence, basically saying they would pay a fighter to break another fighter's arm or to knock another fighter out, kind of like putting a hit out on a fighter in the cage. Such was the case for light heavyweight Lyoto Machida, who was secretly contracted to earn an additional $100,000 for every fight he won by knockout or submission. And for you UFC fans out there, Lyoto Machida made Randy Couture look like he didn't know what he was doing and knocked him out. It's crazy. The author does not clarify where he received this information, but he puts it in the book on page 138. Usually he would say according to, and then quotes the source he's referencing to that he got the information from, but in this case, he leaves his sources disclosed. The author speaks on sponsorship deals, which went very well at first, with companies paying fighters to advertise their company on the fighters' shorts, their shirts, baseball caps, and more. Fighters would sell small spaces on their fighter shorts for advertising purposes, with a company's logo looking like a NASCAR jacket. According to Mike Swick, he says, and I quote, "I had like 10 to 15 patches on my shorts. I looked like NASCAR. Some of those patches were $5,000 to $10,000, unquote. But in 2000 2009, Zuffa and the UFC restricted its fighter sponsor policy by requiring that all apparel brands first pay Zuffa a $50,000 brand affiliation fee before making individual deals with UFC fighters. Fucking nuts. Zuffa also had a new fighter bout agreement which required fighters to grant Zuffa full rights to use their likeness in games with no extra compensation. That's for video games and stuff like that. So basically all the UFC games that you have your favorite fighters in, Zuffa, the company gets paid for it, but the actual fighter doesn't get paid for that. Dana White cut a fighter from the UFC by the name of John Fitch in 2008 for wanting to negotiate terms before signing away his likeness. Dana White says, and I quote, "These guys aren't partners with us. Fuck them. All of them. Every last one of them." Unquote. Fitch eventually came to terms with Dana and signed the deal instead of being blacklisted from the company. We have some big Randy Couture shenanigans. Here. So January 14th, 2008, Randy became the first UFC fighter sued by the UFC. Zuffa and the UFC claimed that Randy's actions had caused damages to the company in excess of 10 grand, and he violated his contractual obligations by disclosing the UFC's confidential information with another MMA promotion, allegedly. Zuffa requested Couture to pay for an unspecified sum for punitive damages. Zuffa also demanded an immediate injunction to prevent Randy from fighting in any MMA promotion outside of the UFC, claiming that his future as a fighter was UFC property. Yeah, so Dana and Lorenzo sued Randy Couture. Then, in the locker room at the 57th UFC event, Lorenzo and Dana handed Randy a $500,000 handwritten check as a bonus, with Randy claiming this as the first bonus he had ever received with the UFC. And knowing that Randy was retiring in 2006, they wanted him to accept a role as a third member of the UFC's commentary team alongside Goldberg and Joe Rogan, and he was paid 56 grand a year for the position. In other Couture shenanigan news, Couture had another affair where he cheated on his wife Trish with a woman named Kim Borrego. Randy and Trish agreed on a divorce, and shortly after he decided to relocate to Las Vegas and pursue a new relationship with Kim. Then shortly after that, he came back from retirement, texted Dana that he could beat the current heavyweight champion at the time, who was Tim Sylvia, Sylvia being one of Randy's old training partners. Dana White texted Randy back and said, "Are you serious, bro?" A few weeks later, Couture had a new 4-fight agreement with Zuffa and was booked to fight Tim Sylvia for a pay-per-view match in March 2007, the UFC's 68th event, and Randy made Tim Sylvia look like an amateur. He dusted him so bad that Tim Sylvia literally looked as if he'd never been in a fight before. Or at least that's the way I saw it whenever I watched it. If you watch it and fast forward it to the 5th round with 54 seconds left, you can hear Joe Rogan referring to Tim Sylvia saying, and I quote, "He can't believe this is happening right now." Unquote. Randy 6'1", Tim Sylvia 6'8", and Sylvia had like 40 pounds on Randy. Randy dropped Sylvia with the first punch he threw and then dusted him for the next 5 rounds. Completely one-sided. Then Randy took his heavyweight championship belt and for the 6th time became the UFC champion. And he had his little shorty with him, Kim Borrego. This nigga Randy is unstoppable. The author ends the chapter speaking about Randy fighting Brock Lesnar in an event that generated $4.8 million from ticket sales and more than $1 million in pay-per-view buys, probably making it somewhere near the top 20 most watched UFC events. The UFC's annual revenue climbed to $275 million that year. And just in case you didn't know, Randy ended up losing that fight. But if this was prime Randy, then I think he could have won, even though Brock Lesnar did beat Frank Mir, and Frank Mir is a fucking animal. I'm not sure if Randy and Frank ever fought, but I'm gonna have to look it up. Peace.